The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, recently published 4 landmark regional assessment reports, one each for the Americas, Africa, Europe and Central Asia, and Asia and the Pacific. The result of 3 years of work by more than 550 leading experts from over 100 countries, the 4 IPBES reports are the most important expert contribution of the past decade to the state of knowledge about biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. The reports focus on answers to key questions about the importance of biodiversity, progress being made to conserve it, and the threats and opportunities for a sustainable future. With the best available information communicated effectively, people all over the world can make better decisions and take more effective action to meet global commitments such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the Aichi Biodiversity Targets, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Biodiversity and ecosystems support more than 4.5 billion people in Asia and the Pacific. But rapid urbanization, deforestation, invasive alien species, climate change, socioeconomic transformations, and loss of traditional knowledge and practices have led to a decline in biodiversity and nature's contributions to people across the region. About 90% of global aquaculture production occurs in Asia and the Pacific. However, an estimated 37% of aquatic and semi-aquatic species are now threatened. Rising land, air, and ocean pollution has also greatly impacted the health of both nature and people. Of the 10 rivers in the world with the highest amounts of plastic waste, 8 are located in Asia, which also accounts for up to 95% of all plastic pollution in the ocean. The Asia-Pacific region has achieved significant economic growth and reduced poverty, while simultaneously increasing the coverage of protected areas and forests. But more needs to be done. The IPBES report highlights the need to increase regionally coordinated protected area management efforts and to improve the application of science and technology, cross-border collaboration, culturally sensitive scenario planning, and the capacity building and empowerment of indigenous and local communities in governance and management of nature. The message from all 4 IPBES regional assessment reports is that, with the exception of some positive examples, biodiversity and nature's capacity to contribute to people are being degraded, reduced, and lost due to a number of common pressures, including habitat stress, the overexploitation and unsustainable use of natural resources, air, land, and water pollution, increasing numbers and impacts of invasive alien species, as well as climate change, among others.
The best available evidence, gathered by the world's leading experts, points us now to a single conclusion. We must act to halt and reverse the unsustainable use of nature, or risk not only the future we want, but even the lives we currently lead. Fortunately, the evidence also shows that we know how to protect and partially restore our vital natural assets.
IPBES, Science and Policy for People and Nature.
Welcome to this session of the IPBES webinar series. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the short video teasing the findings of the Asia-Pacific assessment, and that you are looking forward to going more in-depth into the assessment findings with the assessment co-chairs Madhav Karki and Sonali Sanaratna Salamuttu. Before giving the floor to Sonali and Madhav, I'd like to remind you that the recording of this webinar, as well as a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, will be made available on the IPBES website. On the IPBES website, you can also access a range of other resources, including recordings of all previous webinars, the full report and summary for policymakers of the Asia-Pacific assessment, as well as any other completed assessment, and e-learning tools. If you have any questions about the webinar series or IPBES work on capacity building, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on email tsu.capacitybuilding@ipbes.net. With that, let me hand over to our presenters for the day. Thank you both for taking the time to join us. We look forward to hearing your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be presenting at today's webinar along with my fellow co-chair, Dr. Madhav Karki. The presentation is divided into 5 broad sections, and I will be presenting on the first 2 sections and then handing over to Dr. Karki to continue thereafter. In terms of the rich biodiversity in the region, as you know, the Asia Pacific is one of the most diverse regions in the world in terms of social, cultural, biological, climatic, and geomorphological perspectives. It hosts a number of endemic species and unique ecosystems of tremendous biological diversity and contains 17 of the 36 global biodiversity hotspots and 7 of the 17 mega-diverse countries. It has the greatest marine diversity globally, with half of the world's largest islands and the most extensive areas of coral reefs and mangroves. The IPBES regional assessment for the Asia Pacific actually divided the Asia Pacific into 5 sub-regions, which you can see in the map on the slide. This included South Asia, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and Western Asia, as well as Oceania, and included over 62 countries and territories. Biodiversity and ecosystem services underpin human well-being. The region's population are dependent on this diverse biological diversity in terms of marine, aquatic, and terrestrial biodiversity, as well as ecosystem services for their food, water, energy, and health security. And in addition to this, for cultural as well as spiritual fulfillment as well. There is, however, variation in this dependency across the region. So, in other words, within the sub-regions as well as at the country level. Now, moving on to the second section of our presentation, which is on current status of biodiversity and ecosystems and drivers of change. Nature has benefited the Asia Pacific and the region's 4.5 billion people in terms of biodiversity and ecosystem services that it offers. And this has contributed to the rapid economic growth of the region, which is approximately 7.6% compared to 3.4% global average from 1990 to 2010. It is also amongst the fastest rate of urbanization at a global level. Once again, about 2 to 3% urbanization per year. And agriculture provides most of the region's employment. Overall, the Asia Pacific region has undergone the most extensive land use change to agriculture since the 1960s, compared to some of the other regions. And while huge progress has been made in terms of lifting millions out of poverty, there are still major disparities found in the Asia Pacific, and a high level of poverty still persists in some regions. More than 400 million poor people, in other words, about 52% of the global poor, actually live within the Asia Pacific. And this results in a high demand for provisioning services. For example, nearly 200 million people depend directly on the forest for their non-timber forest products, for medicinal purposes, food, fuel, and other subsistence needs. Lifting people out of poverty requires multiple strategies, including sustainable management of food production systems and sustaining the viability and access to terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems. So in addition to the provisioning services that we just discussed in the previous slide, regulating services are also significantly valued, and their contribution to a good quality of life is acknowledged within the Asia-Pacific region. For example, wetlands are the most valued for their water regulating services, approximately 4,000 USD per hectare per year for regulating water flows, and approximately 6,500 hectares per year for regulating water quality. Similarly, temperate forest ecosystems are valued for their habitats, carbon storage, and for water reserves. But the number of such studies is small and data is generally sparse and actually limited to some ecosystem types and some geographic regions, as you can see in the figures in the slide. In addition, caution needs to be used when transferring, and generalizing some of these economic values for decisions in contexts outside their original value. And therefore, the assessment actually identified that further research through both non-monetary as well as economic valuation studies is urgently required for the region. There are contrasting trends in the status of biodiversity and ecosystem services in the region. All major ecosystems are threatened. This includes forests, alpine ecosystems, wetlands, coastal ecosystems, including coral reefs. There is also a steep decline in key emblematic wildlife, which includes large wild mammals and bird populations that have declined, mainly as a result of habitat fragmentation as well as degradation. There is also a serious loss of crop genetic resources due to the decline in cultivation of native plant varieties. Invasive alien species have increased in number and abundance, reaching critical levels. But it's not all bad news, however, and there has been an increase in forest cover in some sub-regions. For example, in South Asia by approximately 5.8%, and in Northeast Asia by approximately 23%. But the impact on biodiversity remains unclear due to data deficiency and also the predominance of monoculture. In terms of protected areas, there has been an increase in both terrestrial and marine protected areas. For example, between 2004 and 2017, in the region overall, there has been an increase of approximately 0.3% for terrestrial protected areas and approximately 14% for coastal and marine protected areas. However, their coverage of key biodiversity areas is still low, and this suggests that the region is not on track in conserving areas of particular importance for biodiversity as called for under this Aichi biodiversity target. Despite the increase in forest cover, biodiversity is still at risk. and there's a high rate of species loss and threat status. 22% of species and nearly 25% of endemic species in the IUCN Red List are either extinct in the wild, critically endangered, or vulnerable. The figure on the slide shows the overall extinction risk of species in the Asia-Pacific region from data from the IUCN Red List. The largest number of species at risk are in South Asia, approximately 19% of all species and approximately 45% of endemics. With regards to aquatic species, roughly 1 in 3 species of freshwater fish that were assessed are threatened. And in terms of capture fisheries, both ocean and inland water is at great risk due to overharvesting, underreporting, disease, pollution, and also the increase in invasive alien species. So what are the underlying drivers causing these changes? Major ecosystems are directly threatened by a combination of drivers. For example, climate change, which includes sea level and temperature rise, and glacier melting. In most regions, it is noted actually that climate change is expected to be the main pressure on biodiversity in the future. One of the other key drivers, direct drivers, is land use change, particularly conversion of forest cover to agriculture. For example, in Southeast Asian forests are converted to palm oil, pulp, rubber, and timber. Overfishing and overexploitation of capture fisheries is another direct driver of change, with a decline of 70 to 40% of the region's total fisheries production. Invasive alien species. An increase of invasive species due to international trade, transportation, and cross-border migration is another serious issue. And finally, waste and pollution is a threat to marine, for example, plastic waste, as well as freshwater, for example, eutrophication, as well as human health. But we noted that 8 of the 10 most polluted rivers in the world are in Asia, accounting for approximately 95% of the global load of plastics in the ocean. In terms of the roles of drivers and their implications, there are both direct drivers as well as indirect drivers. And as you can see from the figure, the dominant direct drivers in the region overall are land use change, climate change, and resource overexploitation. Indirect drivers such as governance, economic development, and science and technology are also playing an increasingly important role. The direct drivers of biodiversity loss often interact amongst themselves and with the indirect drivers, and this augments the overall severity. Direct and indirect drivers and their interactions require complex solutions. There's a need to better understand these dynamic interactions and plan appropriate responses to reduce biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation at the national, regional, and sub-regional levels. And now I'd like to hand over to Dr. Madhav Karki, who will follow on with the third section of our presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It is a great pleasure to continue the sharing of the highlights of the Asia Pacific regional assessment. together with Dr. Sonali Salamuttu. As you have heard from Sonali, that the picture of biodiversity and ecosystem in the Asia Pacific is mixed, rather it is on decline. So I will be sharing the implication of this decline on the major regional and global targets and goals, especially Aichi biodiversity targets and sustainable development goals. First, I will cover the projection and scenario up to year 2050 and its implication on the biodiversity and ecosystem services. First of all, as you have heard from Sonali, that there is a heavy interactions among drivers between direct and indirect set of drivers. These interactions you have already seen, we see create the highest impact due to climate change, which is exacerbating biodiversity loss. And this interaction is also posing an increasing risk to ecosystem services. Let me elaborate on this. The sustained flow of ecosystem goods and services is fundamental for the sustainable development. And this sustained flow is at risk. For example, as you can see from the picture on the right side, the level of influence of indirect drivers on direct drivers it's highest on policies. Indirect drivers such as policies, bad policies, they will create more biodiversity loss. And this creates, I think, this the role of indirect drivers such as policies, economic development, and change in socio-cultural behavior are playing an increasing and prominent role on biodiversity loss. These interactions are complex and require interactive and cross-sector, cross-scale analysis, which will help policymakers to enhance their understanding and come up with a right kind of solution. As you can see from the picture, that the direct driver, the overexploitation or unsustainable practices and land use change, they are creating the biggest impact. And this, I think, becomes very important for policymakers to keep in mind. Similarly, the scenario for 2050 on the implications of the biodiversity loss on sustainable development goals and Aichi biodiversity targets are as follows. Increase, as you have heard, that Asia Pacific region has been able to increase protected area coverage, and that supports the Aichi achieving of the Aichi biodiversity targets, and also helps achieve the sustainable development goals. But the scenario says the biodiversity loss will continue under certain scenarios. For example, under business as usual scenario, by 2050, it is expected that 45% of habitat and species will be lost. Up to 90% corals will be severely degraded. 24% between 24 to 29% of mammal and bird species are likely to go extinct in lowland forest of Sundaland in Southeast Asia in coming decades. As you have already heard, the fishery scenario looks bleak. There will be rapid decline in the fish stocks, both in inland water system and then the marine systems. And you can see from the graph, the global baseline is shown in green color, and which is also in decline. But under the scenario of decentralized solution, you can see some progress. But if it is under the business as usual scenario, then there will be no progress. So here, what we are trying to see is that decentralized solutions and sustain is one of these options for the policymakers. There are some positive scenarios, and this scenario we can relate to the increase in forest cover and protected area cover. You heard that South Asia, in general, most of the Asia-Pacific regions, sub-regions have experienced increase in forest cover. They have also experienced increase in protected area, especially the marine protected areas, which is helping to achieve the Aichi targets as well as contribute to the sustainable development goals. The increase in forest and protected area coverage provide good progress, especially it helps countries to achieve Aichi biodiversity target number 5. Decline in fuel wood extraction, as you can see in the chart below, that if we compare between 1990 to 2014, the fuel wood consumption, except in sub-regions, have declined, and similarly the demand for wood has also declined. Of course, there are you can see that in South Asia and Southeast Asia it is still increasing, but in Northeast Asia there is a very significant decline. So this helps to have a positive scenario if the countries can effectively manage this increased forest area and protected areas. There is also positive scenarios if countries can reform policies and also continue to improving forest and biodiversity governance, especially the scenario which is based on the assumption that the policies will be reformed proactively, and also the governance and institutional arrangements will also be reformed in a positive direction. That indicates better future for biodiversity and human well-being, as biodiversity underpins human well-being. For example, proactive policies are found to slow down and reverse the trend of biodiversity loss, especially the species loss. And some countries have achieved this through this instrument. Collaborative and coherent actions, that means multi-stakeholder collaboration, cross-border collaboration, and coherent actions, meaning that different sector they plan in a coordinated way. Then that provides a scenario which not only captures the multiple values of biodiversity ecosystem services or nature, because nature does provide multiple values. For example, it can provide at the same time regulating services as well as the provisional services or material services and non-material services for that matter. Apart from these two, proactive policies and then multi-sector collaboration, effective and participatory governance may allow better management of impact of multiple drivers. Since drivers are changing their behavior and they are interacting together and they are creating more severe impacts, our report finds that if the different level of government or the government and community and civil society and private sector, they practice participatory governance of nature, that provides a better scenario of biodiversity and ecosystem services, which means that the ecosystem biodiversity loss will be reduced, if not reversed, if this instrument is practiced. Continuing with the positive scenario, and this would be in the context of the transborder or transboundary cooperation, proactive and cross-sector and cross-scale policy reform and incentive-based mechanism, I already mentioned to you, creates a positive scenario. For example, incentive-based mechanisms such as payment for ecosystem services or rewarding ecosystem service providers or ecosystem service managers with reward, compensation, or recognition of their contribution to enhance biodiversity ecosystem values always creates positive scenario. Similarly, transboundary and regional cooperation based on examples both in marine system and terrestrial system indicates a positive scenario in that biodiversity loss is reduced and also the ecosystem goods and services services flow is improved. In other instances, we also see from our report that community-based natural resource management, especially in the context where the community has indigenous and local people, local communities participating in conservation, that has provided a better scenario based on the example we see in several countries, community-based natural resource management, where indigenous and local knowledge has been recognized and practices have been mainstreamed in the conservation approaches. The biodiversity loss has been reduced. The biodiversity sector also faces inadequate finance. There is not adequate investment in conserving biodiversity, or there is not much investment from private sector in biodiversity conservation. Our report suggests that if we create innovative ideas and practices to rope in private and public sector, for example, through public-private partnership, the countries can leverage finance for nature conservation. There are different examples. For example, in Indonesia and India, business and then the government have partnered and have resulted positive results for biodiversity. So this innovative partnership is providing a better scenario. Now I will talk exactly how these policy options can be implemented. Of course, we also recognize that there are knowledge and capacity gaps. So for the policymakers of the 62 countries and territories in Asia Pacific region, our report suggests that ensuring meaningful participation of local communities for that matter, all key stakeholders in conserving biodiversity is one of the options which we have found has number of countries demonstrating successes. We also feel that integrating different aspects of biodiversity conservation, sustainable development, and also the access and benefit sharing in the management package, and mainstreaming biodiversity in I would say, biodiversity sectors and ministries also provides a good option for the policymaker. So integration or mainstreaming of biodiversity conservation in the ecosystem management into national policies, programs, and practices will provide positive results that can contribute to achieve Aichi biodiversity targets, which all the countries are a signatory to, and that can also help achieve sustainable development goals. These options will also enhance participation from different sectors and stakeholders, because we believe that this type of policy reform will provide incentive for different sectors to contribute, because all sectors states are included in the biodiversity plan, and it will also ensure policy coherence and create synergy. We know that climate change is one of the biggest drivers of change in biodiversity ecosystem services, and countries are signatory to Paris Agreement, but I think they are also signatory to CBD vision and Aichi targets and goals. If biodiversity conservation is done in coherence with the climate adaptation and mitigation, it will create synergy, as we will see in my next slide. Another aspect which is quite highlighted in our report is that nature provides multiple values and diverse values to humankind, and this has not been properly accounted for in the national accounting. Therefore, proper accounting of nature's contribution to countries' development is very, very important, and this is also one of the key policy options. The aspect of finance is highlighted in this policy options. Private sector partnership can leverage finance for biodiversity conservation. We feel that lack of finance is a major bottleneck for achieving conservation success. And there are now many instruments which can bring private sector in conservation initiative. For example, corporate social responsibility, green bonds, and public-private partnership are some of the examples which our reports have provided. And this partnership with private sector, if promoted by countries, it will meet the funding gap for conservation, and it will also scale up the conservation efforts. The another area, I think, which policymakers from the Asia Pacific region can consider is building on success of regional collaboration, which we can see in coral conservation or in controlling Asian brown cloud hedge, or in conserving shared biodiversity in the Himalayas, that can provide positive results. Some of the examples, as you can see from the pictures, the South Asian countries have succeeded in increasing the tiger population. Similarly, in the Himalayas, some of the threatened ecosystems are being better conserved. For example, in Kailash sacred landscape and in Kanchenjunga landscape. Similarly, in the Coral Triangle and in Mekong landscape, we can see transboundary and cross-border cooperation has produced positive results. So therefore, we feel that such regional collaboration needs to be scaled up and promoted in other regions as well. Regarding the innovative partnership, we talked about public-private partnership, but we feel that increasingly NGOs who work directly with the local communities, they need to be also brought into this partnership, especially in examples such as reducing emission from deforestation, degradation, and payment for ecosystem services, because we feel that this incentivized mechanism are done both on a market basis and on voluntary basis. And until now, the payment for ecosystem services has succeeded if it is done on a voluntary basis by the ecosystem community, ecosystem producer community, and ecosystem services user communities. And there the NGO play a vital role. And that's why we feel that public-private NGO partnership is another innovation which countries can promote. Similarly, partnership with the financial institutions, especially in Asia Pacific, some of the countries have a huge cooperative movements of savings by communities. So partnership with banks, with cooperatives, and other financial institutions can not only promote transfer of technology, but also generate knowledge, because I think the financial institution can also support applied research, and it can also build capacity, because the building capacity it involves raising awareness, also mobilizing communities, organizing community, and thus private sector bring in skills to do that. That's why public-private partnership, I think, which have succeeded in some of the countries, can be scaled up and used by other countries also to promote successful conservation. Now, there is another aspect which we have noted that as you have heard Dr. Sonali saying that while some of the countries, some of the regions have rich biodiversity, but the poverty incidence happens to be high in that region. But I think now there is an opportunity that if biodiversity can be conserved, and if it is done in a synergistic, for example, wherever there is a conservation done through the community-based approaches, if we can also bring in access and benefit sharing, conservation for conservation's sake will not work, but conservation packaged with the sustainable livelihoods by giving better access and transparent benefit sharing among the participating community who in conservation efforts, that can result synergy. So that can help countries. For example, in our report, we have provided that the countries should be addressing the underlying cause of biodiversity loss by mainstream biodiversity across government and society. And that involves the targets are awareness raising, biodiversity value integration, incentive reform, and sustainable production and consumption. But so far in awareness building, their progress is poor. But I think in other three, the progress is moving towards positive direction. But there, I think the improvement we are suggesting that the realign incentives, that means remove perverse incentives or remove disincentives and create incentives through integrating biodiversity with livelihood that can result better synergy and minimize trade-offs. Similarly, another aspect of synergy building is between SDG and Aichi biodiversity target. And here, for example, ending poverty was SDG number 1, goal number 1 is very high in the minds of many Asia Pacific countries. So this can be synergized by the countries if biodiversity related SDGs 14 and 15 are sort of attempted with an eye on SDG 1, which means again the example of the biodiversity rich areas should have both the programs in conserving biodiversity, but also in reducing or eradicating poverty. And this can be done by providing them incentive, by improving the access and benefit sharing, by building their capacity. And this has been found to be already a success at a local level in several countries. Notwithstanding all these opportunities which I have presented to you, there are knowledge gaps which most countries are facing. Not only knowledge gaps, but also capacity gaps that need to be addressed. For example, as you have heard, that valuing, recognizing, and monitoring the multiple values of nature is very, very important. But you can see that except the Northeast Asia and Oceania, the other countries have very few studies which have shown how this multiple value conceptualization can be actually done and integrated into policies. So this is an example. So consolidation of experiences in multi-stakeholder governance and embedding biodiversity in the decision making is an area where the countries need to enhance their knowledge. Application of the science and technology to improve food, water, energy security while reducing pressure on ecosystem or reducing the biodiversity loss is a very important area. Some countries have used science and technology effectively and actually hugely reduced poverty and also improved the food security, but others are lagging behind. We feel that proper use of science and technology is a very important area where gap exists, and this gap needs to be filled in. Scenario-based planning, I think tools for better visualizing impact of various policies on biodiversity conservation at different scales gives better understanding for policymakers, and this can prompt quicker decision making and better decision making, especially policy reforms. So scenario wherein we project how the future biodiversity future looks like by certain date. For example, we have indicated 2050 provides the policymaker the urgency of actions that needs to be taken. So similarly, measures of diverse values and value system across the region, while recognized, is still not embedded into policies, and this is still a knowledge gap, and countries have to fill this knowledge gap. So in conclusion, our presentation by Dr. Nali and myself have indicated that overall biodiversity at all levels, the genetic level, the species level, and ecosystem levels are in decline. There are some positive trends, for example, growth in forest cover and protected area cover, but overall the health of biodiversity is poor, and the sustained supply of ecosystem goods and services to support livelihood and sustainable development is at risk. Traditional drivers of change continue to impact For example, the land use change is still very important. Unsustainable use is important. But the new drivers of change, such as climate change, fast urbanization, invasive alien species, pollution, and cultural change, along with migration, are intensifying the impacts on biodiversity. However, there are some rays of hope. Increased realization of economic and non-economic value of biodiversity and ecosystem among policymakers, among resource managers, private sectors, and even general public is increasing, which is a good sign. But the overall scenarios are challenging in that if under business as usual scenario, the biodiversity will continue to be lost, and opportunities for better future for biodiversity and nature's contribution to people might be lost. But these opportunities do exist. So there is a need to seize this opportunity that we can have better future for biodiversity. The assessment provides a menu of feasible options. For example, policy reforms, governance reforms, policy mixage, incentive mechanism, and there are also strategies such as multi-stakeholder strategies and cross-scale, cross-level, and cross-sector analysis of the impact of drivers. And this menu of options are for the policymakers who can choose the options that work for them. There are knowledge and capacity gaps in many countries, and continuing investment in research and knowledge generation, knowledge management is needed for a better biodiversity future. So the take-home messages is biodiversity is our lifeline. We will realize its critical value when it is lost. I feel that we have tried to impress upon policymakers that biodiversity is critical for our survival. We must work to protect biodiversity for our future generation because, as you have heard, biodiversity underpins human well-being. Species are building blocks of Earth's life support systems. We all depend on them, and we need to protect biodiversity at the species level as well as at the ecosystem levels. Asia's biodiversity faces a crisis of historic proportion because biodiversity loss is one of the highest, as you saw from Dr. Sonali's presentation, that if you take the IUCN Red List criteria, South Asia is having the highest threat to its species, especially the endemic species. To minimize this risk, we must protect the hotspots, the species, habitats, rich in endemic species, and we should all do it together. Then we will have a brighter biodiversity future for us and for the generation to come. This work has been possible with the hard work and dedication of more than 120 colleagues from all around the world. We would like to thank them for their hard work, for their knowledge, for their efforts in bringing this report to life. So thank you for your patient listening to our report.
Thank you so much, Madhav, and thank you so much, Sonali, for that great presentation and for taking the time to join us today. Before we end the webinar, I'd just like to remind all of you listening in that you can access the recording of this webinar, as well as a range of other resources on the IPBES website. If you have any questions about the webinar series, or IPBES work on capacity building in general, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on tsu.capacitybuilding@ipbes.net. That's all we had for today. Thank you again for watching. We look forward to have you join us again.